Have you ever thought about the origins of what we call the Eucharist or communion and how it's changed over the last 2,000 years or so of Christian history? Hi, I'm Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political positions, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and our nation. This is episode number 149, and in this recording, Paule Patterson and I spend some more time talking about his book, and specifically this case, chapter 5, or section 5, talking about two different topics. The first is communion, and where it came from, and how we practice it today, and what we might be missing in our modern liturgical practices. Then we switch gears and spend about the second half of our conversation on the integration of consciousness and mysticism. I think I've always held a particular understanding of the word mysticism, and I'm learning that it can be used quite differently than I had been taught or that I had assumed. I grew up thinking of it as that weird old guy in the desert muttering to himself and kind of being crazy. But now I find that it's actually a core and an intelligible and intelligent part of religious practice, or at least it should be if we evangelicals hadn't been taught to fear it. So, if we understand mysticism as a healthy spiritual practice, what about the less mystical practices? How do we integrate mystical practices with the more liturgical, more Western ways of relating to God and to the Holy Spirit? So, Paul and I spend some time thinking about those topics together. And let's get into the conversation. Well, good evening, Paul. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's been a minute. I'm looking forward to it.
It has been a minute. I've been on vacation and got away from this for a while, and it's kind of interesting to turn back into it.
Yeah. Well, good. So
this is our fourth recording, and I think originally we had talked about like kind of doing one section recording per section, and you had 5 sections, I think, before, and maybe 4, and now you're up to 7 plus a chunk. So why don't you tell me about the current status on what you've been doing with the book?
Yeah, and I know we've touched on how this book started as an idea, and then it kept growing. And at one point, about 4 weeks ago, you were part of this process, realizing like, okay, these things are a lot bigger than just like, little articles. They're whole chapters. We need to do some more work here that's kind of gone out of hand. So I went back through and kind of this big picture and was zooming in and out. And about 4 weeks ago, the book came together, and like there was an ending. There were things to it, like the book felt like a thing. And so I knew you were on vacation, and I really want to get this book done because I've been working on it for almost 7 months coming up. And it's been part of my every morning practice, spending an hour or two writing and researching. And it went from whatever it was where you were at, and now it's pushing 170,000 words. But it feels tucked in. It feels, from beginning to end, even like the appendixes and the things that seem out of place, like, no, they're there for a reason.
The fun part for me is going to be, as I dive back into it now, figuring out what I've already read and what I haven't, because you've moved some chunks around. I find myself reading a new section, and suddenly I remember that. So that's been interesting. Yeah. I'm finding, just so you know, that there's definitely some redundancies that I have to go through and clean up. I'm hoping that saves some length on this book, but there's. I'm going to be learning from you, because eventually, when I start working on this other book that I'm thinking about, it's I'm going through the same thing.
Oh, yeah, no. Writing a book, it's a thing. Like it's been making me like take it seriously, if that makes sense. Yeah. All right.
When you start working for other people, which is what a book is, right? It changes the things, as opposed to when you're just thinking about these things ourselves, which is why I write for a blog instead of just writing a journal, because it makes me focus.
Yeah. And there's some weight to some of this now too for me, because it's not just a fun project anymore. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, okay, no. I expect people to read this. I expect
Yes.
people to test it, to try it, and I am aware of some of, what some of the pushback could be. And so it's been for me. Carl Jung talked about how one of his books was this. I think I've even talked about it here already. Was a spiritual process. This book has ended up being something like that for me. Like, I can point to this thing and say, if you need to understand what my Christianity is like, there you go.
Yeah.
And so it's been a big
cool.
thing for me.
So the things I want to talk about today, two chunks. I think we'll have time for both. The first one will be talking about communion, agape feasts, and how that shows up in Scripture, and I think what we can recontextualize about it in the sense of where we are today with our understanding of that. Then the other was what you have in section 5 about the neuroscience of spiritual transformation, which is integrating consciousness and mysticism. And that really was an interesting topic to me. So let's start with the whole issue of communion. And I'll just start by reading the chunk out of, I think Mark 14 is the first place to start. I think you probably know, but Mark was the first gospel that we think was written from the point of view of critical scholarship. Of course, before that came Paul. So Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 11, actually. I'll start with that. Now the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together, it's not for the better, but for the worse. So he's actually applying correction here to this very young church. I think that they understood this was probably written in about AD 53, 54. So it's only 15 years into the life of the church. He says, for to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. When you come together, it's not really to eat the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you proceeds to eat your own supper. One goes hungry and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have households to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. And then he goes on to say, for what I received from the Lord, I also handed to you. And we all know the verses there. So it's important, I think, to recognize that Paul wrote that as a corrective. And then in Mark, the story of what Jesus said was while they were eating. So they're already in a meal, which is interesting. I don't think we really remember that often when we sit down and look at communion. But while they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they'd sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And actually went and looked that up. The hymn, I guess they're referring to, is probably chunks from Psalm 113 to 118, which was traditionally included in part of the Passover meal celebrations that the Jews would have at that time. So that's the scriptural foundation of our understanding. Matthew is very similar, and then Luke expands on it a little bit, and John goes a completely different direction, not really so much telling the story of Jesus' meal, but Jesus is just telling them, "Eat my flesh, drink my blood, or you don't have any my life in you." So
which we do bring back up later in this section of the book. John's use of that, how it's a mystical, it's pulling from like the Greco-Roman pagan mythologies and culture, this idea of consuming a god and being enthused. But John definitely does go a different route. In fact, John will do things with his story that, this is why one of the reasons, if you ever try to take a Harmony of the Gospels class in Bible college, there's a lot of debate about how to try to put all these things in the right spot. Sure. And I think both, if you got Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John together in the same room, they would just laugh at those classes a bit. You guys are missing it a little bit, but you were talking about the dates of Paul's, both Corinthians and Galatians ends up being one of these early letters too of Paul, that predate Mark, and Mark being one of the earliest of the Gospels that we know of for sure, at least in some capacity. And this establishes what the Christian Eucharist is meant to be. This is what it was always like. These ancient people, these paleo Christians who were first trotting on this kind of new ground of doing things, this was at the heart of what they did, of who they were, and what they kept coming back to.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the writing that Paul was doing then was addressing what was going on already, even though there hadn't, I guess, been any official teaching by anybody, other than maybe if we believe that Mark was properly recording something that Jesus did do as a teaching. But there was a flow of the life of the early church around a communion thing, and clearly it was a well understood ceremony of some kind.
Yeah, and also I think we sometimes we forget that there's 20 years between the death of Christ and when we start getting these things. So actually, there's been a lot of movement already. People have been active. We have books like Luke and Acts that record some of the history, and we read of a lot of people like Apollo and not Persephone. That's a whole different person, but. You can read the very ending of Romans 16 and just get a plethora of names that Paul directly references to in the city of Rome, a city that he has never been to yet. He wants to get to. And it's full of Greco-Roman and some Jewish names. It's all over the place, When you read the story of Acts, you hear of the people coming in and out of the church and people rising up in leadership. And they had teachings, they had practices, they had all of this. We're working with what we have to try to figure it out. And I think in some sense, a lot of these people later on were then inspired to, we have to capture this. We have to, now that we're not just one group in Israel or 12 groups spread across the Levant. Now that we're taking over the Mediterranean, we need something. We need some things to work with. And I think at least initially, right, that seems like what the authentic inspiration behind where these manuscripts were birthed from was, we have to share this, we have to capture it, we have to help. Paul's letters are all about correction. We forget he spends 3 years in Ephesus and a year and a half in Corinth. There were all these, can you, in an hour, accurately describe all the conversations you had this last week?
Of course not.
No. Like how? So when we come to the Agape Feast in Corinth, we have to remember that Paul spent a year and a half with these people,
right? And
we have to remember who these people were.
Yeah, and so in your manuscript, you write that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around AD 53 to 54, he addressed a community he'd previously spent 18 months with. Corinthian church, like so many early Christian communities, met in private homes and celebrated the Lord's Supper as part of communal meals. These gatherings, known as agape feasts, combine elements of Jewish Passover traditions with Greco-Roman banquet customs, like you said. Participants shared bread and wine, symbolizing unity and remembrance of Jesus' sacrifice, but it was probably a lot more than a cracker and a cup. And so as an aside there, I think that's one of the things that I think we've lost in modern church culture is we've kind of reduced it to a symbol, to a celebration instead of a meal. So yes, there were rituals, but much more than rituals, there was this communion. And I think that's really what Paul is getting at in 1 Corinthians. He's basically saying, hey guys, you've lost that community aspect of it by how you imbibe or you overeat while other people are not doing as well.
Yeah. We've touched on this before, right? I think maybe this is where we kind of wrapped up on one thing, but I remember being tossed and torn between like growing up as a Christian teen and then going through Bible college and then going to a Baptist church, being torn between like the Restoration movement, where it was like an emphatic part, like it was part of the signs and the covenants. Like you had to, this was one of the, like you had to take this every week. And if you didn't take it every week, then you weren't part of the true faith. But then I was also working at an independent Baptist church who took it maybe every month, every quarter. And, they had the typical line down of an outward sign of an inward change. And it always felt like baptism, that was about baptism, but, sorry, I confused the two there. But they had a kind of similar approach to communion too. It was like, we don't want to take it all the time because it might lose its meaning and stuff. And it was more like this, I don't know. It felt like communion was meant to be something in between. Not like, I don't know what it was, but then, so I was kind of lost in the mix back then. Um, Today, it's a different experience for me. It feels really simple, and it's, all right, we take the body of Christ in and we drink his blood. We remember the story. We remember these scriptures. We remember the gospels. We remember the corrections to Corinth, to the city of Corinth, and Paul's wordings to the city of, not necessarily to the city of Philippi, but we remember these scriptures, and we become it, and we go through the same death, burial, and resurrection that Jesus did, trusting in his message. And what I find when I try to do this is anything that's me, anything that is I'm giving attention to, it points it out really quickly. I know, like, when I'm trying to take the body and the blood of Christ, if I'm in a right position or not. It calls things out really quickly. And that's back in the agape feasts, they were already doing these kind of things. The Jews had feasts built into their religion. They had 7 feasts that were like, you had to spend part of your tithe on feasts and festivals. We've almost kind of lost a theology of how to party in a healthy way. How do we celebrate in community and individually? How do we do this in a healthy way? But that was built into their system, and the Greco-Romans had the same thing. When we ate, it was a spiritual thing. When we ate together, it communicated things like family and allegiance. It communicated things like who you belonged to and who was in and who was out. And all these cultures also had these unique rules and rituals and customs about what was proper and wasn't proper. And so, so just contextualize, if we can, then, the city of Corinth and what they were trying to do. They were trying to do something not so much different than what was already being done, but at the same time, completely opposite. It wasn't about the fixations and the hype and the euphoria and the distractions and the distancing and the cognitive dissonance. It wasn't about those things. It was about you and Jesus getting real.
So you're touching on 2 different things that I think are worth noting here. That there's the communal aspect, and then completely separately, I think there is this liturgical aspect. There's the coming together, the celebration, those things, but then there's also this thing that ends up becoming the pure symbolism, that the liturgy, we do this to remember kinds of things. And I think those 2 are both important, but they're separate. And I think what we've lost currently in our culture is the communal aspect of it, as opposed to the symbolic.
Yeah.
Whereas what Paul is talking about is the communal aspect. I think he's focused on the practical, the pragmatic, how we live together as we do this thing.
Yeah, I think it might be a both and situation.
I think so.
If you do communion right, it's an individual thing. It is pragmatic. The things that come up when you prepare yourself for the Lord's meal should be, the little pragmatic things that I didn't do. It should be the things from the week that between Monday and Sunday morning, and then Sunday afternoon and back again. What were the things that got in my way this week? What are the things I need to die to? What are the things I need to remember? What are the things I need to be grateful for and have some joy and to accept? And maybe I need to get over my pity party and actually accept being happy. These things are contextual and unique to each person. So there is this personal, mystical, subjective side, but the communal side is just as important, because if we can't relate, if we can't have communications and relationships and trust, then we also miss out on the thing that fundamentally also makes us human, that human connection, things like joy, love, acceptance, belonging, even like curiosity and wonder. These are human things. When we experience these things, they don't fully feel complete unless we can feel it with someone else. And I think part of the reason of that is that almost this mystical thing that we have within us, we want to know that another consciousness can experience the same thing, that they were a part of the same thing. because at least that means something. Like that meant something because it actually had meaning. I can like in my experience of life, there's these kind of things that I fall back to, those things that I can really trust. And it really doesn't matter what the big or small questions of life are. Those experiences I can't deny. And so the Lord's Supper became both liturgical, where we as a people go through this as a communion, but then also individually, every person needs to approach this rightly too.
So I'll challenge you with something here, not because I think you're wrong, but because I observe something that a lot of the things you describe about how you approach communion, I don't think are directly required in the Bible, which is not bad in any way, shape, or form. I think they're wonderful. That's a great place to be. But I will say one of the things that I recently kind of began to reframe in my mind about communion was that, Paul uses the phrase unworthy manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd always been taught that was about not being saved when we approach the table of the Lord.
Yeah,
together.
right.
And, I was taught that unsaved people taking communion could bring judgment on death upon themselves. But if you actually read what 1 Corinthians 11, like verses 27, is talking about, it really has to be the preceding chunk, I think verses 17 to 22, which are about the actual manner in which they partook, not what was going on in their lives separate from it, but this way of unworthily segregating themselves in the act of communion. And so for me, that reframing takes that sense of, I'm scared that I'm going to be doing it wrong, and I have to go before God and make sure my heart's right.
Sure.
It takes that fear out of that thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that leaves me thinking that what you're describing is an amazingly valuable liturgical cycle for us, to as we approach the Lord in any way. What is blocking that for me?
Yeah, and I think I hear your pushback, and I think it's fair.
And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what you're doing.
Well, I think in some sense I'm trying to describe what it is supposed to be, not supposed to be like, right? And some wrong words there, but when we approach this thing as each human will, they have to interact with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. When it comes to an unworthy matter, you're absolutely right. And Paul and others, James is going to will hit this too, about how they fight over their seats. There is a way to approach community that is healthy and not. And to instantly, as soon as we take the community around the Eucharist and make it unhealthy, it doesn't matter how great the Eucharist is. It doesn't matter how doctrinally sound the Eucharist is. You can take anything of God and twist it a little bit. I think we've proven this by now.
Yes. This whole idea of how we approach community, I think, is really central to what you're talking about in this entire book, because it has to do with the body, the corporate body, the arising of the Son of God as a corporate man in some sense, this much larger thing than any one of us. And so when Paul or James or whoever begin addressing how we do community, whether it be communion or something else, I think that is really central to the message of the scriptures. It's not just the practical stuff of, how are we doing this liturgical thing? I think it's much bigger of how are we forming a body of Christ. And so Paul was directly addressing that thing. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by taking that corrective of how we love one another practically and making it about a ceremony. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it teaches us to bifurcate it in the rest of our life. By doing that, we make religion a checkbox. Yeah. We justify, we change our word for love around. So we say things like love the sinner. Yeah. Thank you. Like we say things like that, but really what we're doing, if we're really honest with ourselves about what's going on inside, is we're justifying hate. Yeah. We're justifying a line that we're drawing. We're justifying a wall. We are justifying lack of forgiveness. And at least if we can be honest about those things, we can do something with them, or maybe, we don't have to overreact, or that stuff doesn't get out and cause problems in the world. Right. But that just doesn't isn't the case necessarily. And we have ample case studies about toxicity within churches. We have ample case studies that we don't always do it right. And we have a lot of people in our own lives and around the world who, in some sense, are exiting Christianity, but still authentically searching for something real. Because I think in part because they know there is something real to search for.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, again, like you can take God and put it in the middle of a community and get the community to twist it and put a wall around it. And now the community is God.
Yeah. So you use a couple different terms, or three different terms generally scattered around what you've written here about love feast, agape meal, and communion. Are you making a differentiation between those? Because
no, definitions matter, and how we perceive these things matter. And I think in most of theology, perhaps for a lot longer than most modern theologians might like to admit within the Protestant world, we've been debating the wrong questions and using the wrong definitions.
Okay.
I think words like Eucharist and communion and love, agape feast in general are describing the same thing. And we need to be a little cautious about trying to differentiate too much. But I think also, if we can nail these definitions down and be accurate about them and authentic, it allows for cultural context. It allows for variation and diversity. It allows for Group A, in Georgia to try the Eucharist a little differently than us hippies up here in Missoula might try it. It gives allowances for that individual to come into a community and for that person to say, this isn't for me, and for the community to go, yeah, that's fine, but you can still hang out. You can still be at the table. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters, is that if you want to be a part of us, there is no condition that you have to be matched. You just be a part of community.
And I think we touched on centered set versus bounded set last time.
Yeah.
And that's a centered set issue as opposed to a bounded set of this is what we call it, this is how we do it, and if you're not part of that, you're not in.
Yeah. And I think, by the way, I think this transcends to the world at large. This isn't just within the church, because that idea I loved, and I chewed on it for a while. We're so used to institutional top-down hierarchies. It's like the assumption. And I started wondering if, and partly because of this book, why do we assume that's the way it has to be? Mm-hmm. In Missoula, just this last Saturday, we had a big old march and people talking about how we don't need a king anymore. And ironically, it's not lost on me that this message shows up in my book too. So here's my thought then is, why aren't we doing it? We think this way, so why can't we think this way, where we can be, like you said, center set and up and out? Mm-hmm. But instead we keep, and I make this point, I think, later in the book, quite pointedly, that the reason that we have kings is because the masses still want them.
Yeah. Which
means you and I. The reason that we still cuss about billionaires is because we still buy products off Amazon. Nothing against Amazon. Why are we pointing the finger at them? There are some big questions that the world and us adults need to probably really start wrestling with on different ways in the world. But that's kind of the crux of the issue, isn't it? Is the reason that the world is the way it is because we've made it this way.
Yeah. So talking about this, I think you just using a analog of a funnel perhaps in what you're describing there, but a
little bit. Yeah. I don't know.
The thing about what Paul was addressing, I think, in the letter to the Corinthians was about coming together more effectively, being more centered set in their thinking about how they approach the liturgical aspects of the communion, in the sense of what I've discovered is that when you sit down to a meal with somebody, you really cannot remain separated from them.
No, right?
if I sit down with a homeless person for dinner at the homeless shelter, I'm going to have a very different experience than if I just go there, give him food, and leave.
Yep.
And I will walk away from that meeting having learned something about that person, learned something about what makes them tick, how they got
Or you will
there.
have gotten up before that because you got uncomfortable.
Yeah. And if I require myself, and this is, I think, what Paul was challenging them to do, if you require yourself to sit with people that are not like you, to be willing to enter into a communion, right, with somebody who is different than you, then you cannot help but begin to understand, empathize with, and love them in a way that causes the kingdom to grow and to be more solid.
Here.
Instead of, like, I've just done my spiritual liturgical duty for the week so that I'm on a right footing with Jesus. You know, it has a very different need.
Is so tired of that, by the way. Like,
it is.
Yeah.
And that's probably what drew people to the church early on, was this togetherness that they experienced. And it was driven by things like these love feasts. Yeah.
And I think it's a both and thing. I drew it for you, for us. In AA, since before I got sober, AA started giving me handles on things.
Mm-hmm.
Language, I could see things about myself that I couldn't unsee. Like, there were things that were true in it that described me that I couldn't get away from, at least. And so it started giving me some handles. And one of these handles it gave me was that the boundaries of my control end with my actions. Like, all I control is my decisions. And this is where I started my second rehab was gratitude and radical acceptance. And I'll just say, it wasn't like this thing. I'm every freaking day practicing these things, and it's like every little day I'm trying 1% to get a little bit more down. So, like, it's not it doesn't happen always like this, right? But AA gave me this idea that the boundaries of my control end right here. It's really not, it doesn't go any further than this. Everything else is assumptions. Everything else is entitlements and things I think I deserve or whatnot. But really, no, it just ends right here. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about communion, we're talking about, I like to draw this little circle.
Yeah.
With a you and me, and remembering that I don't control you and you don't control me. And that's fine, because the world is already out of control. We can just exist together. Mm-hmm. But communion and community doesn't often look like that. There's rules and assumptions and status and infighting and gossip and bickering. And then, and then things, it doesn't, this is not what communion in our normal life looks like sometimes. Relationships can get weird and that can mess with us. So the early Christian church and these agape feasts were a lot more than just communion. They were something radical and real. They were something that I think would stand out even today. When like I remember I used to love to preach this. I used to love to say that the church should be so diverse that the only thing that would make sense, that's keeping us together, is Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that's, in some sense, what we start seeing in these agape feasts is these ragtag early believers who are willing to take a risk and try something different than all the other things going on around them.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I hope
and I sit here because of them, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And my heart for our culture, our Jesus movement, our Jesus following the way, whatever you put a name to it these days, mm-hmm. culture, is that we can get back to that level of common union. And I think the love feast is a really big part of that for me.
We definitely have lost hospitality, neighborliness. We've lost some things that.
But I don't think we think that. I think what we I think what we think, kind of hard there, but I think what we tend to think we believe is that we do it, but in practicality, it's only with this group of people. That self-segregation that happens. I want to be with my kind. I want to be with my comfort zone while I do these things.
Yes.
So we kind of idolize the idea of non-segregation activities, but we don't do it very well. So,
yeah, and it's easy to fall into. Really easy.
So let's change topics.
Okay.
I want to touch on this thing about integrating consciousness and mysticism, and I think it's not at all related to what we were just talking about, but it's all part of your thought process here. So I'm going to read a chunk out of something from somebody who's talking about Richard Rohr. And he says, "What is truth? A better question would have been, am I being true?" Well, actually, you wrote that sentence, but that lines up with what I've been reading in Rohr's book, The Immortal Diamond. And he's talking about the true self versus the false self. And I think those correspond roughly to Jung's two halves of life. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he references that in an article that I've just read today. And the false sense kind of corresponds to Freud's ego self, if that makes sense to you, because you have more training in that than I do. And so the question to me becomes, am I being true to myself? Am I willing to set down my intellectual ideas about truth and to rather become and to live truth directly? So it's less of an intellectual exercise, if you will, than a practical lived message and method. And so moving back to experiential Christianity instead of like the Enlightenment kind of intellectual Christianity, where, knowing is what brings salvation. So to me, it almost feels like we've gone to back to a kind of Gnosticism in a sense.
Thank you for saying it.
Even while we deny the truth of Gnosticism and we call that heresy, I think we have this kind of a Gnostic approach to salvation. And so it's a secret knowledge that leads to salvation instead of how we live and treat each other. So
yeah, one of my most popular blog posts on Drunk Pastor actually is trying to show that evangelicalism is Gnosticism.
Okay.
And I might even send you the link here in a second, but no, I'm on the same page there.
So this touches to me this whole idea of integrating the consciousness and the mysticism, because I think it parallels this true self, false self, two halves of life things around, am I being true to myself instead of am I thinking about myself right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the way you framed the question, I almost feel like you answered it, Brandon, right? Like, back to, Richard Rohr he's just kept showing up over and over again with this, as I kept writing this book, that he kept showing up more and more in the book. So, I'm going to kind of sidestep a little bit I'm trying to pull up your notes I have in front of me. Sidestep a little bit, the conversation on Rohr. Sure. Other than to say the true self, false self, in contrast with what I think you were describing with Rohr. I think Jung was maybe encapsulating in some sense the first half of life, maybe more talking about the timeline. Okay. While I think Rohr is more talking about the fact that you and I can have a true self and false self at any moment. Mm-hmm. I would love if the book wasn't long enough already to include a breakdown of looking at modern day music and showing how these things show up all the time. We admit these things to ourselves, when we're being honest, even our sitcoms, like the things we watch, the things we find entertainment in, the things we joke about, like we talk about these things quite often and like we are aware of it, but to actually sit with it and then to be real with it, where to let them match, that both that left brain knowledge, with the right brain experiential kind of and not just those two parts, but the frontal cortex and the limbic system in the back, let the whole thing that's in there. And I think sometimes what we do with our consciousness is we try to like fragment these parts, or at least in some sense, that's what ends up happening as we become fragmented. We're aware of it all. Huh? Is
that why you're using the word integrating consciousness and mysticism?
Yeah, I think a solid case can be made that integration is sanctification. I think if we understand what integration is, seriously, and then line that up with what sanctification was meant to be, we see it. It's to become whole. And this works with atonement, what atonement is meant to be, where we get that at one again, which is why this works with communion, back to that oneness again. In fact, this is part of the mysticalness of even communion is that there can be one thing out of many. Mm-hmm. What is that? This was an old philosophical debate that, goes back to Plato and others. And so back to, the false self and true self. Am I being true then is probably the most one. I don't want to say it that way, but it's one of the most important questions that can help guide us in life, because if I can be true, if I can just get that down, then almost anything else I can handle. Even if I don't know if that's true, I can handle that. I can handle not knowing if that one thing out there is true, but at least I have everything else down. Because in essence, all of what we are is experience. All of what we are is just our consciousness and what we are aware of. We're constantly moving forward in an ever constant present moment. And then we attach things to that in stories and narratives and meanings, and we have to get on schedules, and now we need a career, and we have to pursue the American dream. And then we build an economy that's, levels above even what natural is anymore, that we forget that we live in literal constructs called construction buildings. And, and this isn't necessarily natural. Neither is looking at screens all the time. And this stuff affects us. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons we go back and I spend some time in neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscience expert by any means. Studying it helped me in recovery. It helped me understand what was going wrong up here. And at least that helped me a little bit. Mm-hmm. It helped more awareness, gave me more things to work with. But as I was going through all this, I was also realizing that if spiritual transformation that we talk about in the Bible, things like the fruit of the Spirit, these other things I read about meditation and doing things in secret and meaning with your God, and the subjective side of all this, the honesty and standing before him. If all that be true, then all of this also has to happen up here. Mm-hmm. We're not and for me, this seemed like a simple thing. And I think the reason why it's not a simple thing is because we in our society have put a line between what I just said. We think that it's spiritual there and then physical here. And this is that duality, that dualism that we've been debating for so long. Are we one or are we two? Is there evil and good? And what am I? And then we get lost in it. We get caught up in it. And we get so caught up in the debate that we forget that we can be good now.
You're almost quoting things from Immortal Diamond, which is funny to me, because he spends a lot of time talking about what salvation means in the sense of at one-ment, and this integration of ourselves is absolutely right out of what he's talking about. And then how we do that as a community is critical in his way of thinking, because obviously Rohr is a universalist, and he's strongly of the opinion that it only works when it all happens as a global community. And to restore that community, that common union, is absolutely critical to bringing the earth to salvation. And it's not just it's not just we go to heaven eventually.
Yeah, and I'm coming around to that. I might say, I don't know, he's still on my checklist to read. He's loaded up next in my audiobook queue. I'm still trying to finish Thinking Fast and Slow. But I would say that salvation isn't just the thing that comes in the future. It's the thing that happens now, right?
Well, and that's how Jesus was very explicit about that, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He never once said salvation to somebody and meant go to heaven. He meant, let me bring you wholeness in this life you're living right now, so that you can turn and bring wholeness to those that are around you. And as a people, then the nation becomes whole. The nation in the larger context, because of course he generalizes that to the entire world.
Mm-hmm. And this, I think we can tie this back to our left brain thinking of knowledge. Mm-hmm. We can have this relationship with knowledge that we know a thing and therefore it somehow makes us better. that's not how knowledge works. In fact, if we really want to get kind of specific with how this thinking can pathologize things, it becomes this triangulation that we do with it, where it's like, I know a thing, therefore I'm better. And so now we have this weird relationship. We can have this weird relationship with knowledge where, instead of, it's like we have to have a reservoir of knowledge that we keep track of, but that's not how knowledge works. When we study, it gets in.
It changes us.
It changes us. It comes from when you and I learn something and really learn it, it's now part of us. And that's what knowledge is. And that's not a left brain thing. That's a left, right, top, bottom, front, back thing. It's a whole body thing.
I read a really sad kind of a tweet today from somebody that it wasn't a tweet, it was Threads, but they basically said, you're so highfalutin about how many books you read. He says, I do much better than that. I have 15 AI agents that I send and get them to collect summaries of that thing that I want to know. And then it gives me so I have then hours to spend in my day that you're wasting reading these books. And I'm like, you're missing what that book is doing to a human, because you're just absorbing a couple of bullet points instead of sitting with something and steeping in it and letting it affect and change you. And it's so sad to see that.
You are talking sexy, Brandon, if I can say that. No, but you are so right. No, have a relationship with the book. Go back and forth. Let it move you. Let it debate you. Let it challenge you. Let it inspire you. Like, like don't. And to be frank, there are times summaries can be great, but I doubt that guy is trying to get it in him.
No.
I doubt he's trying to understand it.
He wants another tool for his toolbox that he can wield against things.
Yeah, and
it's not about changing himself.
Yeah, and let me just say, I was that guy. I had an improper relationship with knowledge for far too long, until eventually, this stuff broke me and called me out on it. So I get it.
Same. I think I could say that about myself as well.
Sure. But we feel safe with knowledge, right? It makes us feel safe. And I think in some sense, this is where Jesus would be like, well, let's talk about that, huh?
Yeah, because I think, and I've said this a lot in the last year or so, we moderns, we people who have been badly affected by the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, crave certainty, and we want some checklist that tells us if we're in a good place or not.
Yeah, amen. Yeah.
So
please.
You mentioned left brain, and I actually wrote this down in my notes. I'm generally a very left brain, logical language person. I mean, if you typed me, I would fall strongly in that side. But I'm also extremely good at synthesis and pattern recognition, which are very right brain activities. Mm-hmm. My wife will observe that, we're driving somewhere and she just used to be able to open a paper map and she's trying to figure out, where we are in this thing. And I just, reach across cockpit there and tap on it. So we're right there and we're about to come up to this turn. And she, I do that kind of thing. And she said for years that I'm an amazingly complex person because of that. So it's really hard to tell where I fit in all this neuroscience that you're bringing up. Like, you wrote, I think, William James, a pioneer in the study of religious experience, also explored the potential of altered states of consciousness. You're talking about neuroscience and how it works in our brain and, the types of perception that we have, the types of processing that we have. And, it's interesting to read those things and then in what you've written and then try and fit it into my concept of self and how I know that I live. I'm puzzled by those things about myself, but you touch on some interesting stuff.
Well, okay. And I think we can use what you just talked about to illuminate some things, right?
Okay.
By no means do we not have all this stuff going on with us. In fact, it's amazing. We can cut out an entire side of our hemisphere and still be us. Mm-hmm. Now we can notice some things that happen about that. Similarly, we've done this test where we've split the two hemispheres down, cutting the corpus callosum and then
I read about them.
Yeah, right. And then it's like there's two different people that are in there. Now, I think, Brandon, you still have the experience where you have felt that like old self, new self, or false self, true self.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could probably maybe you have your own examples of how you can relate to Paul in Romans, where he talks about that which I don't want to do, I do, and that which what I want to do, I don't do.
I wrote a song about that.
Okay. This is all you still, right? Like, it doesn't really matter. And I don't want anyone to think that maybe I'm not talking about them, because that's what we're trying to say, is that this is why mysticism is a real thing. Because you have that right brain, but you don't just have the left brain. But by the way, it's a lot more confusing than that. I think at one part I show like 6 or 7 parts and how what we call I goes through all these things. The corpus callosum, not just the hemispheres, but even like the frontal cortex is bifurcated.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, when we think of I in our executive decision making and how we do imagining and planning, that happens in that front part up here. And even that's kind of split in two. We don't know almost diddly squat still about how the brain works. I mean, that's not a fair thing. We know a lot, but we're still debating it. We're still trying to figure out. We don't know what consciousness is yet. Not a single thing has proved it has. Mm-hmm. We're back at the beginning. It's fascinating. At the end of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, I think this is the end of the Gentiles. We're back to the beginning, asking the same questions about what is this reality that we live in, and secondly, what is consciousness? What are we? And I think it's not too similar from the 2 circles that we drew and talked about. It's and do I exist, and can I exist with others? Is the world hostile, or is it not? And can I love and actually be authentic with it? Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I highlighted a paragraph that you wrote, and I really love this one. Mysticism is not an outdated relic of pre-scientific thinking, but a vital aspect of human experience that continues to offer profound insights into the nature of consciousness and reality. By integrating mystical practices and perspectives into our lives, we open ourselves to a richer, more nuanced understanding of our place in the cosmos and our potential for growth and transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of pins all that you're talking about into a neat little chunk there.
Yeah, I want to take that and do a little bit better job talking about why neuroscience and mysticism overlaps.
Okay.
I think. And I think it's part of that duality thing that we were talking about, how we live in a body, or that we have a body and we debate what this is and where it's going to go and whatnot. You and I all have a personal relationship with this thing. We can glorify it. We can hide in it. We can not even think about it. We can get fixated on other things in life, right? Money, prestige, and whatnot. But we all have a relationship with this body. And what mysticism does is it breaks all these barriers where we draw lines between things. One of the reasons why I think mysticism helps us is it gets us back in touch with our body and puts us in the present and the here and now. Mysticism helps us clear the mental chatter, the constant noise. It helps us understand when our own pathologies and our own proclivities get in the way, those things that instantly stop us. Mysticism gives us the tools to go deeper. It gives us the tools to go into the subconscious. And even like the mystic bravery, the courage to ask the question, what is it that I can let change and let go of? Mysticism gives language to things like surrender, and those things that we can experience in true worship, and what we can experience in the mornings when we wake up and we have our morning practices, if we have one, or maybe we have an evening one. Maybe we don't have one, but we do have ways that we can engage with the divine, and we are allowed to do that. We have permission to do it because God never took it away. And maybe we should, I'm going to jump ahead. I can see, this sounds like a prophet or something. Sorry, no, but I think an age of mysticism is coming. We're getting in touch with this stuff. I think we're still avoiding it. There's even this like hesitation in Eastern philosophy, like Western philosophers don't like Eastern philosophy. Like they kind of automatically shrug it off. And why? I'm confused. Why? Because when it comes to medical science and integrated health, we are using things like mindfulness. We're using things like acceptance. Like we're using all these Eastern philosophy things to actually better improve the lives of people. So why is it that we still have this distance that when it comes to Eastern philosophy? And it's the same thing that we see in the Christian church, like Eastern mysticism. I talked about a friend of mine who he's planning a church and he's using meditation and some more mystical practices. And he's already contending with accusations of heresy.
Of course.
Yeah. Religion keeps us away from God, but spirituality should force us towards it.
Yeah. I've been participating in a contemplative spirituality group for about 2 years now, and it was drastically, shockingly different from what I grew up with as an evangelical.
I bet.
But it has a value and a deepness to it that is completely lacking in what I grew up with. And Rohr talks about this in Immortal Diamond significantly. He's very much a mystic himself. I think it probably is helpful to recognize that mystic means different things to different people. Mm-hmm. You're using the word very differently than I think I would have used it not long ago, because I understood it to mean someone who's really kind of la-la, they're not really all there. They're just, they're just imagining things and they're wandering around talking to themselves in the desert. And that's very much not what it means. And so when somebody kind of rejects the idea of mysticism, probably they're using a different cultural context for that word than we are.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to use the word mystic in such a way that it becomes a normal thing for every human being. I'm suggesting that we're all mystical. This is why we like art and creativity and imagination, why we like hugs, why we put pictures on the wall, and why we like symbols. We are mystical. I think in some sense, the mystical side is where we find meaning. Because meaning is one of those things. Where do you point to in the world, in the objective world, if you're part of the age of reason?
Yeah.
And say, like, you can't put meaning under a microscope. And so mystic we're all mystics. We all have our unique form of mysticism, potentially. It should look different for all of us, partly because we're all neurologically wired differently. We're all in different bodies. We all have different stories, different contexts. From the age of birth, from the moment our consciousness entered the world, enough has happened to make us uniquely distinct from everyone else. If we really want to feel special, we can.
I think this is where you're going to run smack into, I'll probably impolitely say, the fundamentalist idea, where, and I think this is a good time to bring up 2 Timothy 3:16. All scripture is useful for training, rebuking, correcting, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. And of course, it starts off with theopneustos or theopneustos. And there's two different ways to interpret that word. And I kind of grew up with the interpretation of all scripture was God breathed. Mm-hmm. And I think I've come to understand recently that I think a better reading of that word is God breathing. It's a very active thing where Jesus as the living word, as opposed to the Bible being, I'll get hate and discontent for this saying, but dead words on dead pages, that nonetheless do point us to the living word and are therefore useful for all those things. And so you can approach scripture from two different perspectives. One is it's a book that has a lot of checklists and rules in it, or it's a thing that draws me into a relationship with the living God and the living word that is being spoken to me here and now. And so when you approach people that think about that from a sola scriptura, I've got everything I need on the written words on the page perspective, they're not going to like the word mystic, because to them, it takes away control. It takes away their control over the word, really. It requires them to surrender to a living God speaking something in the moment that may confound their expectations and their understandings. And for me, over the last 5 years, that's been one of the most fundamental changes to my thought process, is being able to start seeing that I have to, and this is, I think, fitting into your definition of mystical, is living in a relationship with a living God and having an ongoing prayerful sense of hearing what's being spoken, God breathing in the moment, as opposed to, let me open the Bible and find the verse that answers this question. Yeah. Instead of having it shaped me and molded me into the point where there's this ongoing thing where I'm mystically, and I'll bring that term in here, receiving and hearing and living in a God environment, a God moment, a God presence at all moments. And so that's, I think, where this integrating these things comes together. I should be imbibing things from the liturgies and the flow and the patterns of a daily life in a church, but I should also be living and experiencing and integrating this mystical ongoing thing at all times. So I think that 2 Timothy verse gives me a different sense than it used to because of that.
I've been thinking about kind of the same concept from 2 Timothy to correctly handling the word of truth. As a recovering pastor, I have not done that well, but I've also thought about this like along the same lines of what you were talking about when we speak truth, like real truth, deep truth.
Yeah.
We can do that in a wrong way.
Yeah.
It's called manipulation. We can convey the wrong things without knowing it. This could be, our hatred and our disgust, our own projections that we then throw out into the world, which is what I think James is talking about with how we light fires to all of creation with our tongue.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about mysticism is that it was around before, or at least around during the time of Constantine, with Pseudo-Dionysius, who was one of the first ones to kind of give that word a name, what mysticism was. It was already part of Christian canon and fodder. It was already part of what it meant to be Christian. It's like now we have to convince them to get it back in. And so I don't mind some of the pushback that some of this will get, from one part. Let it happen. That's fine. It's kind of how I feel part of it. Like even sola scriptura, even the scriptures speak of these things. Yes. Even your own book, like you will be judged by this own book and the things you ignored in it. So be careful about that. This is why James talks about, when you approach the word, it's like a mirror. Don't forget what you look like when you engage with it. All mysticism is that it's the language of things that can't be spoken. We all have that. We all have things that hit us that we can't put words to, or we just have to sit and kind of stew in and wonder or process or have some cognitive dissonances. This is mysticism. When we have elation and joy and we get caught up in the moment, every love story is a mystic story. Yeah. It's those things. In some sense, it's what makes us human, and not a rock and not an animal, but human, where we can walk on earth and engage with the divine. We are both soil and spirit. And it's, in the debate out there in the world, some people are debating whether or not we live in an alien simulation.
Yeah.
And
I've seen that.
Yeah. Well, I've really wrestled with it. I've wondered about it because we've talked about how, on paper, I'm kind of agnostic. I don't know. But, the universe itself is pretty dang big and it seems to be aware. So that's a decent starting point for me. But maybe that awareness is an alien simulation. And I went there. I've spent time there, and I've felt it, if that made sense. And I came away from it with this conclusion. Oh, well, like then that we've been in it the entire time. We're still talking about a freaking God who could make a simulation. Like, it's not much different than from what we're already talking about. If it's a God that's out there, that's one thing. And if it's an alien civilization that's done this,
what's
they're God.
What's the difference? Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
What's the difference?
I get to live this life. And experience it and do some things in it. And I should be grateful. Not should, but I get to be grateful. Yeah. Mysticism is the language of the unspoken. It's what connects us as humans. When two humans can look and make eye contact and not say a thing, but still have a connection. It was a mystical moment.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the next chapter because I want to see where you go with this framework that you're laying. So like I said, I'm up to section 5, and I think I'll start working on 6 next. But yeah, this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think 6, we do some philosophical history, trying to kind of get us to the upper moment. So this is actually where I do put roar in, because of earlier conversations with you. But 7 is where I get really excited. And this is still, as I mentioned, I'm still stewing, and I'm hoping to, by the time we get there, we can talk about what the Holy Spirit is. We can talk about we've already done eschatology, but what the Holy Spirit is and what atonement is then. And if it's as simple as a simple one-to-one connection where there's nothing else in between us, if it's just that simple, we can model it and we can do it. So why aren't we?
There's a lot of trade space for conversation there. Well, this has been great. Yeah. I think this is a good place to cut for the week, and we will certainly reconnect soon.
Yeah, no, I appreciated it. Every time I meet with you and we talk, I'm always excited to I got ideas now. So here we go.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. It was a joy.
So what do you think? Does this inform your understanding of communion and mysticism? I hope you learned something new like I did, and I'm looking forward to my next conversation with Paul as I dig into the next sections of his book. We'll continue the conversation soon, so I hope you'll subscribe to be notified of the next episode. And as always, thanks for spending some time with me today, and we'll talk again soon.